This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate, and our guest is Glenn Greenwald. He's back in Brazil from Hong Kong, where he broke these major stories on the National Security Agency and what it is doing with our email, our phone calls, and much more. Aaron?
Well, Glenn, I want to go back to Obama's interview with Charlie Rose on Monday night. Obama dismissed fears the NSA's bulk collection of metadata could potentially be abused.
The very fact that there's all this data in bulk, it has the enormous potential for abuse, because they'll say, you know, you can, when you start looking at metadata, even if you don't know the names, you can match it up. If there's a call to an oncologist and it's a call to a lawyer, and you can pair that up and figure out maybe this person's dying and they're writing their will, and you can yield all this information. All of that is true, except for the fact that for the government under the program right now to do that, it would be illegal. We would not be allowed to do that.
Glenn, so that's Obama saying that we have this trove, but it's not accessed basically unless there's probable cause. Your response?
Okay, first of all, the fact that there are legal constraints in place, as we've seen repeatedly throughout history, is completely meaningless if there's no meaningful and robust oversight. And there is nobody that looks over the NSA's shoulder and finds out whose metadata they are linking to the actual identity of the person, whose metadata they're investigating, and putting together dossiers. It is completely within the discretion of the NSA, checked only by other executive branch agencies to determine that. Secondly, there is nothing easier in the world than linking these telephone numbers to any individual. Anybody could do that with very little effort. The American government, the NSA, collects these massive databases that contains all sorts of information about people that enables a picture to be put together that is very invasive. So whether or not there are rules that the NSA has adopted internally that say you can only do this if you have reasonable belief that the person is engaged in wrongdoing, is completely independent of the fact that, as Obama himself says, there is massive potential for abuse inside an agency that is incredibly secretive, and that has very few checks and mechanisms for limitations on that abuse. And that, I think, is the key point. And this is, you know, we have had more debate in the last 9 or 10 days over what the NSA is, what it does, than we have had in the last 10 years. And that's ultimately really what our journalism is intended to achieve, is to drag all of this out into the spotlight and make us understand what the NSA's capabilities are, what kinds of potential for abuse there is, and what the checks on that abuse are, or the lack thereof.
Glenn Greenwald, I wanted to get your response to Republican Congressmember Peter King of New York. Speaking to CNN last week, he called for your prosecution over the reporting you've done on Edward Snowden's revelations.
Actually, if they willingly knew that this was classified information, I think action should be taken, especially on something of this magnitude. I know that the whole issue of leaks has been gone into over the last month, but I think something on this magnitude, there is an obligation, both moral but also legal, I believe, against a reporter disclosing something which would so severely compromise national security. As a practical matter, I guess there have been, in the past several years, a number of reporters who have been prosecuted under it. So the answer is yes to your question.
Glenn Greenwald, your response.
Well, first of all, I would defy anybody to go and look at anything that we reported and identify a single piece of information that even conceivably has harmed national security. The idea that we have somehow tipped off the terrorists to the fact that the U.S. government is monitoring their telephone calls and emails is completely idiotic. Any terrorist who's alive has known for many, many years that the U.S. government is eagerly attempting to do that. The only things that we've revealed are things to the American people that they didn't know about how their communications, not the communication of the terrorists, are being monitored. Secondly, there's this thing in the United States, it's called the Constitution, and the First Amendment to it guarantees the right of freedom of the press. And what freedom of the press means, if it means anything, is the right to, as a journalist or even just as a citizen engaged in journalism, go in and investigate what your government is doing in the dark, and then use the mechanisms of the press to inform your fellow citizens about what it is that they're doing. That is the heart and soul of investigative journalism. So if you take Peter King at his word that anytime national security secrets are revealed, it would mean that any investigative journalist, by definition, is a felon and ought to be prosecuted and criminalized. There was a column in the Washington Post by Mark Thiessen, who is the primary apologist and defender of the Bush administration's torture regime. He was a Bush speechwriter, also essentially saying that I committed felonies, and the Washington Post did as well. It's incredible how menacing that is. If you're looking for threats to America's national security, you should look to the people who are calling for prosecutions in this case, not to the people like Edward Snowden or myself who are exposing it.
But Glenn, are you afraid? Are you afraid for your safety, well, your privacy, etc.?
Well, I think if you look at what the U.S. government has been doing over the last 5 or 6 years, it would be irrational to just dismiss the concern that they may prosecute journalists. They've embraced theories that do criminalize journalism. They've convened a grand jury in the WikiLeaks case, even though WikiLeaks did nothing more than report government secrets. They didn't steal them. They didn't play any role in obtaining them. They embraced a theory that James Rosen, the Washington bureau chief of Fox News, was a co-conspirator in felonies by talking to his source. So, of course, there's a concern that this kind of legal jeopardy will become real, but it's not a fear that will deter me in any way from continuing to report very, very aggressively on these stories.
Bradley Manning is being tried at Fort Meade. That's the headquarters of the National Security Agency. Can you talk about the significance of that and how they're related, Glenn?
Sure. I mean, I think the critical context for everything that has happened here, from Snowden's leaks to his decision to leave the United States and go to Hong Kong, the context of it is this incredibly vicious and unparalleled war on whistleblowers that the Obama administration has been waging. And of course, that war on whistleblowers is as vividly apparent in the case of Bradley Manning as it is anywhere else. Here is somebody who didn't release any top secret information. It was all secret and classified. There is zero evidence that any national security harm came from it. There's certainly no evidence that he intended any national security harm. He, too, could have sold that information or given it to a foreign government that was hostile to the United States. He didn't do that. His intent clearly was to blow the whistle. And yet he's almost certain to be in prison for the next 2 decades, probably, if the U.S. government has its way, for the rest of his life at the age of 25. He was, as the UN found, subjected to very abusive detention practices. And so when you say that Ed Snowden shouldn't have left the United States or anything like that, the context is that the U.S. government has proven that whistleblowers will be severely and harshly treated as a way of deterring and intimidating people from engaging in further disclosures.
Glenn, the NSA has promised to come out this week with details on the plots that it says have been foiled by surveillance. Your assessment of what you've heard so far, we've heard talk of phone records being used to foil the subway bombing plot in 2009, and also your assessment of the news that the NSA is saying that 300 phone records were searched last year.
So this is the playbook that the U.S. government has been using for I don't know how many decades to delegitimize any disclosure, going back to the Pentagon Papers when they accused Daniel Ellsberg of helping the communists in Vietnam and jeopardizing and putting
Glenn,
at
we
risk
have 10 seconds.
The lives of American service members. So it's completely irrational. I think any of those claims should be very rigorously scrutinized because they don't stand up to scrutiny.
Glenn, do you have more pieces coming out?
Yes, we do, including in the next couple days.
Glenn Greenwald, columnist and blogger for The Guardian. We'll link to all his articles at democracynow.org. Democracy Now!